Preston Croft had a thick ring of sweat soaking through the collar of his custom Oxford shirt. Across the mahogany board table, the main display monitor pulsed with a red alert frame. Stratum Health Technologies' flagship account, a consortium of 24 regional hospital networks representing $22 million in annual recurring revenue, had just locked all enterprise database access and served us with a formal 72-hour cure notice. Preston stammered through an explanation, his fingers trembling as he tapped against his tablet, trying to hide that he was completely out of options. I sat directly across from him, holding a porcelain mug of dark roast coffee, completely unbothered by the atmospheric panic choking the room. I did not raise my voice. I did not rush to offer rapid-fire solutions. I simply watched the chief executive officer of Stratum Health sweat through his third luxury shirt of the morning while his executive team stared at the warning indicators in absolute helplessness. My name is Owen Vance. At 54 years old, I have spent 16 years navigating healthcare technology, including 7 years building Stratum's operational infrastructure from the ground up as Vice President of Commercial Operations. Today, however, I do not work for Preston. I sit across from him as Chief Strategy Officer of Nexus Health, Stratum's primary market competitor, brought into this crisis meeting. Because his core platform is hemorrhaging patient data logs, and his remaining leadership team lacks the capability to stop the damage. 4 months ago, this conference room had a very different dynamic. Back then, Preston had stood at the head of this table, tossed my 300-page market strategy into a recycling bin, and dismissed 7 months of my labor as an over-engineered joke written by a glorified middle manager. Now, he was looking at me like a drowning man, begging for an operational lifeline he could no longer afford. To understand how the chief executive officer of a mid-market analytics firm managed to vaporize his company's most lucrative relationship in under 100 days, you have to examine 3 critical questions. First, how did a routine software patch trigger a multi-million-dollar contractual default across 24 regional hospitals under federal healthcare data integrity mandates? Second, why did the low-cost offshore support team Preston hired to trim expenses end up completely oblivious to a systemic architecture failure? And finally, how did a discarded expansion strategy become the exact operational blueprint I used to secure an executive role at Nexus Health, paying triple my former compensation? The answer does not begin with the emergency board meeting, nor with the frantic off-hour phone calls Preston tried placing to my personal line. It starts 7 years earlier in the high-stakes trenches of enterprise health analytics, where I quietly constructed the operational engine that kept Stratum profitable while executive management took the credit. When I joined Stratum Health Technologies 7 years ago, the enterprise onboarding pipeline was a disaster. The company was bleeding client relationships, maintaining an enterprise client churn rate of 21%. Regional hospital networks were constantly filing complaints regarding misrouted billing data, corrupted patient tracking records, and delayed compliance reports. The board was desperate for structural stability, which is why they brought me on board. Over the next 7 years, I built Stratum's operational framework from scratch. I designed the custom data ingestion protocols, authored the compliance validation scripts, and built communication bridges between our software engineers and executive hospital administrators. I memorized the edge case code anomalies that occurred when transferring legacy medical files into modern cloud architecture. By my 6th year, I had reduced our enterprise churn rate down to an industry-leading 1.8%. Under my watch, Stratum expanded its platform to handle data flows for 52 separate regional hospital networks without a single regulatory violation or major outage. Outside Stratum's downtown Chicago headquarters, my life required the exact same quiet discipline. As a single father raising a 15-year-old son, Toby Vance, every financial decision I made carried real weight. Beyond supporting my son's education, I was the primary caregiver for my retired father, Walter Vance, an 80-year-old former civil engineer whose pension could not cover his escalating medical bills and physical therapy. I needed stability, which made me tolerate work conditions that an executive with fewer personal responsibilities would have walked away from years ago. That was my primary character flaw: excessive organizational patience. I consistently prioritized company longevity, system integrity, and smooth client operations over claiming personal credit or setting hard career boundaries. I operated under the naive assumption that superior work speaks for itself, believing that if you quietly hold an enterprise together, institutional recognition will naturally follow. Recognizing that Stratum's core market was approaching saturation, I spent 7 months conducting an exhaustive operational audit. Working late into the night after my son Toby went to sleep, I analyzed shifting federal regulations, privacy mandates, and procurement cycles. The result was a comprehensive blueprint for a $15 million multi-region market expansion framework. The strategy outlined a precise method for scaling our platform into untapped Midwest hospital networks, projecting a conservative $40 million return in new recurring revenue within 24 months while maintaining absolute compliance safety under federal standards. The structural foundation of Stratum began to fracture when CEO Preston Croft hired Gavin Thornton as the new Chief Revenue Officer. Thornton was the textbook definition of a corporate parasite, a slick executive who viewed operational rigor, compliance checks, and systematic testing as slow overhead that impeded rapid scaling. Armed with sharp suits and buzzword-laden slideshows, Thornton immediately gained Preston's ear. He began lobbying executive leadership to bypass our strict data ingestion compliance protocols in favor of rapid, low-margin client onboarding. The operational split became absolute during an executive strategy session in Stratum's third-floor conference room. CEO Preston Croft sat at the head of the table, flanked by Chief Revenue Officer Gavin Thornton. The objective was to establish our growth strategy for the upcoming fiscal year. Gavin Thornton stood up first, projecting a glossy slide deck onto the wall. His proposal was simple, reckless, and tailor-made for short-term executive bonuses. Thornton proposed cutting operational expenditures by 40% through aggressive restructuring. His plan involved firing our domestic operations team, shutting down manual compliance validation protocols, and shifting all platform monitoring to an outsourced offshore support firm operating on automated, unverified ingestion scripts. Thornton promised that by stripping away operational bloat, Stratum could artificially inflate quarterly profit margins while slashing overhead. When Thornton finished, I took the floor. I distributed printed copies of my 7-month, 150-page market expansion proposal. I systematically walked the executive committee through the real numbers. I explained that cutting human validation protocols and handing complex medical data routing to an offshore team without institutional context would inevitably corrupt patient tracking logs and violate federal regulatory standards. I demonstrated that my $15 million expansion model, while requiring disciplined initial capital investment, built the necessary infrastructure to scale our commercial revenue to $40 million safely and sustainably. Preston did not review the data tables. He did not ask a single technical question about compliance integrity or database latency. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, let out a dismissive chuckle, and pushed my proposal away with the tip of his pen. "Owen, this is classic operational paranoia," Preston said, looking around the room to invite the rest of the committee to join in his amusement. "You have spent 7 months producing a $15 million over-engineered joke written by a glorified middle manager who does not understand high-level growth mechanics. We do not need a $15 million monument to bureaucracy. We need lean, aggressive scaling, and Gavin has provided the blueprint for it." The executive committee chuckled on cue. Preston officially rejected my expansion framework on the spot, ordered me to shelve the project permanently, and directed me to begin immediately preparing our operational procedures for transfer to Thornton's newly contracted offshore vendor. My professional ethics left me no choice but to respond formally. That evening, I drafted an exhaustive 8-page internal memorandum addressed directly to Preston Croft, Gavin Thornton, and Stratum's corporate legal counsel. In the memo, I outlined the exact technical vulnerabilities, compliance liabilities, and contractual default risks associated with replacing trained domestic system specialists with automated ingestion scripts. I explicitly warned them that our flagship account, the 24-hospital regional network, operated under custom legacy database code that an off-the-shelf automated script would inevitably corrupt. 2 days later, the memorandum was returned to my inbox with a handwritten note penned in red ink by Preston Croft across the cover page. Received and noted. Stop building obstacles to executive directives and execute the offshore transfer immediately. Preston had formally dismissed my warnings without reading them, placing short-term margin optics above operational reality. He expected me to quietly train my low-cost offshore replacements while shouldering the hidden burden of keeping the infrastructure stable in my off hours. He failed to understand that by dismissing my expertise, he had stripped away the single barrier protecting his company from structural catastrophe. The third quarter executive performance review took place in Preston Croft's corner office. On the top floor of Stratum's building, featuring views of the Chicago skyline, across the polished oak desk, Preston sat holding my annual evaluation dossier. Over the preceding 3 months, Chief Revenue Officer Gavin Thornton had aggressively rolled out his offshore operational model, cutting administrative headcount by 40%. What Preston chose to ignore was that the platform had not crashed during this period solely because I was working 60-hour weeks, quietly resolving syntax errors, fixing legacy data conversions, and intercepting broken software patches between 8 in the evening and 2 in the morning from my home computer. I had maintained our enterprise client churn rate at 1.8% through sheer uncompensated personal effort. I sat down expecting a straightforward conversation regarding the commitments Preston had made to me over the previous 18 months, my promotion to Senior Vice President of Commercial Operations, and the distribution of my earned performance bonus, which was explicitly tied to maintaining enterprise client retention above 95%. Instead, Preston shut the folder without reading my self-assessment metrics. He leaned back, crossed his hands behind his head, and gave me a condescending smile. "Owen, we need to calibrate expectations," Preston began, his voice dripping with smooth corporate patronization. "The board is thrilled with the cost efficiencies Gavin has delivered. The automated offshore ingestion pipelines are handling the heavy lifting now, which frankly demonstrates that our core infrastructure does not require as much specialized executive management as we previously thought." I kept my expression entirely neutral. "Preston, those offshore ingestion pipelines fail an average of 14 times a week on non-standard data transfers. They are only functioning because I spend my nights manually rectifying the failure logs before the morning reporting cycles hit our health system clients." Preston waved his hand dismissively in the air. "That is administrative detail. Owen, the macro metrics look fantastic. Now, regarding your inquiry about the Senior Vice President title and the performance bonus pool. The Executive Committee has reviewed our organizational structure. We feel your current compensation package is already at the upper boundary for your role. To be completely blunt with you, your career trajectory at Stratum has essentially peaked at Vice President. You have reached your natural ceiling here in this current market environment with executive layoffs happening across the tech sector. You should simply be grateful for a steady paycheck and a stable position." The words hung in the air with absolute clarity. It was an explicit statement of operational exploitation. Preston viewed my 16 years of industry experience, my 7 years of dedicated system architecture, and my 60-hour work weeks not as foundational enterprise assets, but as cheap labor that could be taken for granted indefinitely. In that single quiet moment, my long-standing organizational patience completely evaporated. The illusion that loyalty and silent hard work would eventually be rewarded was dismantled. I felt no immediate urge to argue or attempt to convince Preston of my intrinsic worth. A profound, calculating clarity replaced my long-held dedication. I recognized that my loyalty had been treated as an exploitable resource, and I resolved never again to perform a single second of uncompensated labor for an enterprise that devalues my baseline contributions. I stood up, picked up my folder, and looked Preston directly in the eye. "I understand your position completely, Preston. Thank you for making the company's perspective entirely clear. "Glad we have alignment, Owen," he replied, assuming the matter was closed. Returning to my office, I immediately implemented a strategy of strict contractual boundary enforcement, what the corporate world terms work to rule. I opened my contract and reviewed my explicit, written job description. From that minute forward, I executed only the tasks formally listed within those boundary parameters. I logged off my corporate workstation at exactly 5 in the evening. I removed my personal cell phone number from the internal company directory, leaving only my office desk extension. I disabled remote administration access on my personal laptop, ensuring I would no longer view or clear system failure logs during off hours. Finally, I removed my private unwritten diagnostic scripts and local shortcut tools from my workstation, storing them strictly on a personal external drive. I did not sabotage a single file or alter a line of production code. I simply ceased donating my personal time, private tools, and tacit knowledge to maintain an operational framework that management insisted was fully automated. Over the following 3 weeks, I executed my daily duties at Stratum Health Technologies with detached professionalism. During core business hours, I managed vendor communications, attended mandatory administrative meetings, and completed routine tracking. But at precisely 5 o'clock every afternoon, I packed my bag and walked out of the building. Without my nightly manual interventions, small operational friction points immediately began to surface within Stratum's ingestion framework. Minor data formatting exceptions from regional client uploads sat uncorrected in system queues overnight, accumulating until the following morning, when Gavin Thornton's offshore support leads sent panicked instant messages regarding delayed validation queues at 7 in the evening. Those messages remained unread until 8:30 the next morning. When I arrived, I would process the logs strictly according to standard documented corporate protocol, a slow manual process that built mounting backlogs across internal departments. While Stratum's daily operations began showing subtle signs of drag, I actively shifted my career focus outward. I scheduled a private breakfast meeting at a quiet hotel downtown with Eleanor Wright, Chief Executive Officer of Nexus Health. Nexus was Stratum's largest enterprise competitor in the medical analytics sector. Known for high operational standards and substantial engineering investment, Eleanor Wright was a sharp executive who had tracked my career across the health tech sector for years. Across the table, I did not badmouth Preston Croft, nor did I complain about corporate politics. Instead, I brought out a bound physical copy of my $15 million multi-region expansion strategy, the very document Preston had dismissed as an over-engineered joke. I presented the expansion blueprint to Eleanor, walking her through regulatory integration frameworks, custom data routing compliance protocols, and financial forecasting models demonstrating a direct path to $40 million in scalable recurring revenue across untapped Midwest hospital networks. Eleanor spent 45 minutes reviewing the technical specifications and risk mitigation matrices in complete detail. When she closed the binder, she looked at me with immense professional respect. "Owen," Eleanor said, placing her hands on the table, "Preston Croft throwing this plan into the trash is the single greatest executive error he has ever made. Stratum has been coasting on your operational back end for 7 years, and they do not even realize it. Nexus has the capital, engineering scale, and strategic vision to execute this expansion model immediately, and we want you leading it." 3 days later, Nexus Health extended a formal executive offer letter for the position of Chief Strategy Officer. The compensation structure included a base salary, guaranteed executive performance bonuses, and long-term equity options that combined to equal exactly 3 times my total compensation package at Stratum. Furthermore, the offer contract granted me complete operational autonomy to build my own systems architecture team and execute the $15 million market expansion framework without administrative interference. I signed the offer letter immediately. The following Monday morning, I walked into Preston Croft's office and handed him a brief formal resignation letter, providing standard 2 weeks' notice. Preston looked at the single sheet of paper, a smug grin spreading across his face. He leaned back in his chair, thoroughly convinced that my resignation was an emotional reaction to his refusal to grant my promotion weeks earlier. Well, Owen, Preston said, tossing the letter onto his desk without a second thought. I appreciate your service over the years, but given that Gavin and his team have successfully digitized and automated our core ingestion workflows, your timing actually works out quite well for our fourth quarter operational budget. We will not need to replace your position. Gavin Thornton, who happened to be walking past the office, stepped inside and chuckled. We appreciate you doing the knowledge transfer over the past few months, Owen. The offshore team has everything under control on the dashboards. We will handle it from here. Neither Preston nor Gavin offered a counter-proposal, attempted to retain my services, or scheduled an exit interview to audit system dependencies. They were so blinded by short-term spreadsheet metrics and misplaced confidence in unverified automation that they believed my role was redundant. They failed to realize that the automated dashboards they relied on were merely visual displays masking structural instability, and that the primary engine keeping their multi-million-dollar health network infrastructure operational was walking out the door for good. During my final 2 weeks, I strictly fulfilled my basic contractual obligations. I handed over documented operational manuals, completed standard human resources offboarding paperwork, and ensured all corporate files were organized according to policy. At 5 o'clock on my final Friday, I turned in my security badge, shut down my corporate computer, and walked out of Stratum Health Technologies into a bright, lucrative future, leaving natural consequences to take their course. 6 weeks after my departure from Stratum Health Technologies, the inevitable operational collapse triggered by management's reckless reliance on untested automation erupted into full-scale enterprise panic. What Preston Croft and Gavin Thornton had naively assumed was a simple, fully automated software environment quickly exposed itself as a vulnerable, highly fragile infrastructure. It began on a Tuesday morning at 3:14 in the morning with a routine software update pushed by Gavin Thornton's offshore technical group. The offshore team, working without institutional domain knowledge or human compliance validation protocols, deployed an automated ingestion script across Stratum's core database. The script was designed to process incoming patient diagnostic logs and billing records across all client accounts. However, the offshore engineers failed to account for a critical legacy structural nuance. Stratum's flagship client, a 24-hospital regional healthcare network generating $22 million in recurring annual revenue, operated on a customized, non-standard HL7 data framework that required specialized handling rules. When I was at Stratum, I spent hours every evening manually reviewing and routing these specialized HL7 data streams, using custom-built validation filters to ensure legacy patient records cleanly translated into our cloud database without corruption. I had kept this complex operational mechanism functioning quietly behind the scenes for 7 solid years, insulating executive leadership from technical friction. Without my uncompensated off-hour oversight, Thornton's automated ingestion script forced the non-standard hospital data through standard conversion pipelines, instantly breaking data integrity across the entire enterprise software ecosystem. The operational results were instantaneous and catastrophic. The automated scripts stripped critical structural fields from incoming medical records, corrupting patient tracking logs, misallocating diagnostic billing codes, and scrambling admission entries across all 24 hospital facilities. By mid-afternoon, hospital administrators across the Midwest discovered that their emergency department patient flow software, electronic health record tracking, and pharmacy dispensing reconciliation systems were reporting corrupted, completely unreliable data. Clinical operations began experiencing severe administrative delays, creating immediate operational chaos for medical staff on the front lines. Recognizing the extreme clinical risk to patient care, the hospital network's executive board took immediate, aggressive action. They locked Stratum out of their enterprise servers, froze all ongoing vendor payment disbursements, and issued a formal legal 72-hour cure notice under federal healthcare compliance regulations. The legal notice explicitly cited severe breach of contract terms, triggering automatic financial penalties of $150,000 per day for operational disruption, with a hard deadline stating that if full system integrity was not restored within 72 hours, the $22 million contract would be terminated immediately alongside full civil litigation for operational damages. Inside Stratum's downtown headquarters, total executive chaos took hold. Preston Croft summoned Gavin Thornton to an emergency conference meeting, demanding to know why the system had collapsed and why the automated ingestion pipelines had not flagged the corruption. Thornton, sweating profusely through his tailored shirt and clutching a tablet showing rows of glowing red error codes, had no answers to offer. He was forced to admit that his offshore team possessed zero understanding of the underlying legacy codebase, and that their automated scripts were stuck in an infinite processing loop, continually recorrupting incoming hospital data files every time they attempted a hard system reboot. Realizing that no one remaining inside the company possessed the technical capability or operational knowledge to repair the database architecture, Preston panicked completely. He retreated to his private corner office, locked the door, and dialed my personal cell phone number. The call did not connect. It went straight to a pre-recorded carrier message stating that the subscriber was not accepting incoming calls from his number, as I had permanently blocked his line weeks prior following my resignation. Preston then tried sending an urgent email to my former corporate address, offering an immediate emergency consulting rate of $750 an hour if I would step in to fix the database failure. Within seconds, his message bounced back with an automated system notification. Undelivered mail. Receiver account has been permanently deactivated in accordance with corporate offboarding policy. In absolute desperation, Preston ordered Stratum's chief information officer and internal IT security team to physically access my former office workstation. He demanded they locate and extract the custom Python diagnostic scripts, manual error handling macros, and proprietary validation tools I had used for 7 years to maintain the enterprise platform's functional stability and data security. The IT director logged into the local workstation drives and examined the system's storage logs, only to inform Preston that the diagnostic tools were nowhere to be found. Upon my formal resignation 6 weeks earlier, I had fully sanitized my local workstation drive in strict compliance with Stratum's explicit corporate data governance policies. The policy clearly mandated that departing personnel remove all personal utility scripts, unverified macros, and local executable files from corporate hardware upon termination to prevent unauthorized data liabilities. I had followed their written corporate policy to the exact letter, leaving no trace of my private utilities behind. With no proprietary diagnostic tools available, no internal staff capable of deciphering the legacy HL7 routing architecture, and an offshore support team paralyzed by complex system error loops, Stratum Health Technologies stood completely paralyzed. The corporate clock was ticking relentlessly down on the 72-hour legal cure notice, accumulating $150,000 in daily breach penalties. While the $22 million enterprise contract teetered on the brink of total cancellation, Preston Croft was finally forced to confront the harsh truth. The operational backend he had dismissed as an over-engineered joke, and the middle manager he had publicly mocked, were the sole pillars keeping his entire enterprise from falling into complete financial ruin, with 24 hours remaining on the 72-hour legal cure notice. The atmosphere inside Stratum Health Technologies' executive boardroom was suffocating. Stratum's board of directors had taken emergency control of the company, setting aside executive authority as the financial reality of a $22 million default loomed over the firm. Total enterprise liquidation was no longer a theoretical risk. It was an impending reality scheduled for 9 o'clock the following morning. Preston Croft sat at the center of the mahogany table, looking visibly hollowed out. Beside him, Gavin Thornton stared blankly at a stack of legal correspondence from the hospital network's outside counsel. The board of directors had convened an emergency session to consider a single unsolicited restructuring offer that had arrived at 6:30 that morning from Nexus Health. The proposal offered a complete operational bailout. Nexus would immediately step in, stabilize the client's corrupted data stack, assume the primary enterprise service contracts, and shield Stratum from catastrophic litigation in exchange for an emergency transfer of technical infrastructure rights. The heavy double doors of the boardroom opened. Preston straightened his tie, expecting Eleanor Wright, the formidable CEO of Nexus Health, to walk through the entrance to dictate terms. Instead, I walked into the room. I wore a crisp charcoal executive suit and carried a leather briefcase. Behind me were two senior legal representatives from Nexus and our lead software architect. I did not rush. I did not smile triumphantly, nor did I display any lingering corporate malice. I simply walked to the head of the conference table, set my briefcase down, and took my seat directly opposite Preston Croft and the Stratum Board of Directors. The silence across the table was absolute. Preston's mouth opened slightly, his eyes tracking my movement in utter disbelief. "Owen," Preston stammered, his voice lacking any of its former executive authority. "What is this? What are you doing here?" "I am here representing Nexus Health as Chief Strategy Officer, Preston," I said calmly, opening my leather folio. "And I am here to present the terms under which Nexus will save your enterprise from total bankruptcy." The chairman of Stratum's board of directors, a stern man who had seen millions of dollars in enterprise value vanish over 6 weeks, leaned forward. "Mr. Vance, we are listening. Explain the operational mechanics of this proposal." I distributed physical copies of the Nexus acquisition agreement across the table. "As of right now, Stratum has precisely 22 hours before your flagship client executes its legal right to terminate its contract and file suit for operational damages. Your domestic team lacks the domain knowledge to repair the database, and your offshore group's automated ingestion scripts are continuously corrupting patient tracking logs. Nexus possesses the exact systems engineering capability to resolve the HL7 data anomalies and restore total clinical data integrity across all 24 facilities within 4 hours." "How?" Gavin Thornton interjected, his voice desperate and defensive. "Our engineers have been running diagnostic sweeps for 36 hours straight. The legacy codebase is completely locked in an unhandled exception loop." I looked at Thornton with cool detachment. "The codebase is locked because your offshore scripts strip the custom compliance header tags that I designed 7 years ago to route non-standard regional files safely. You treated institutional memory as unnecessary overhead, Gavin. You replaced systemic validation with cheap automation, and now the system is operating exactly as your bad choices dictated." I turned back to the chairman of the board. "Nexus will deploy our engineering task force immediately to patch the platform, clear the diagnostic backlog, and satisfy the hospital network's cure notice before the deadline. In exchange, Nexus will assume primary governance over the $22 million enterprise hospital contract. Furthermore, Stratum will execute an immediate asset transfer of its core platform intellectual property to Nexus at a 55% valuation discount, allowing our firm to integrate your software stack directly into our enterprise network." Preston stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "This is absurd. This is predatory. You are asking us to hand over our primary commercial asset for pennies on the dollar. This whole strategy is an aggressive corporate takeover." "Sit down, Preston," the board chairman barked, his eyes locked on Preston with burning frustration. The chairman turned to me. "Mr. Vance, if we execute this IP transfer, how does Nexus intend to scale these accounts and recover system stability?" I reached into my folio, pulled out a bound physical document, and slid it across the table directly to the chairman. "We will execute the precise multi-region framework contained in that document," I stated clearly. "It is a $15 million compliance and market expansion strategy that I authored over 7 months. It systematically restructures back-end data routing, stabilizes client workflows, and opens untapped regional channels projected to yield $40 million in scalable recurring revenue over the next 24 months. The board chairman opened the document, scanning the technical diagrams, risk mitigation matrices, and revenue projections. He looked up, his eyes shifting from the document directly to Preston Croft. "This plan is extraordinarily thorough," the chairman noted, his tone heavy with sudden realization. "Why was this expansion model not implemented at Stratum earlier this year?" "Because," I replied, keeping my eyes fixed on Preston, Chief Executive Officer Preston Croft publicly dismissed that exact document as an over-engineered joke written by a glorified middle manager. He chose to cut operational expenses by 40% under Mr. Thornton's advice rather than invest in systemic operational stability. The room remained dead quiet. The board chairman slowly turned to Preston, who stood frozen, unable to formulate a single word of defense as the entire board realized that their current corporate ruin was the direct result of executive arrogance. "Preston," the chairman said, his voice dropping to an icy, measured tone, "pick up that pen and sign the restructuring transfer now." With hands visibly trembling, Preston Croft leaned over the table, picked up the pen, and affixed his signature to the Nexus takeover agreement. He signed away Stratum's core intellectual property and flagship client contract, formally acknowledging in writing that the exact strategic framework he had once mocked and thrown into the trash was the single operational pathway capable of saving his enterprise from immediate liquidation. 8 months after the emergency summit in Stratum's boardroom, the operational integration was fully complete. Under my direction as Chief Strategy Officer at Nexus Health, our engineering team successfully deployed the $15 million expansion framework across the acquired infrastructure. We stabilized the 24-hospital network within 4 hours of contract signing, eliminating all operational friction and completely restoring data integrity. Over the subsequent 2 quarters, the expansion framework performed exactly as my original data had predicted, opening untapped regional markets across the Midwest and generating over $40 million in new recurring enterprise revenue for Nexus. My professional life had undergone a total transformation, with my executive compensation package, performance bonuses, and equity participation at Nexus, equal to 3 times my former earnings at Stratum. I achieved total, unshakable financial independence. I established a permanent, fully funded educational trust for my 15-year-old son, Toby Vance, guaranteeing his future academic path without financial burden. For my retired father, Walter Vance, I paid off every dollar of his remaining medical expenses and secured long-term specialized private health care that ensured his comfort and dignity for the rest of his life. The structural fallout at Stratum Health Technologies was proportional and swift. Following an exhaustive internal audit that confirmed operational negligence, Stratum's board of directors voted unanimously to terminate Preston Croft in disgrace for cause, revoking his severance package and stock options. Gavin Thornton was quietly ousted shortly thereafter, his corporate reputation severely damaged across the technology sector as industry press covered the catastrophic failure of his short-sighted cost-cutting initiative. Stratum itself was reduced to a minor subsidiary, its core software assets fully absorbed into Nexus Health's market-leading platform. Occasionally, as I look out from my broad executive office, on the top floor of Nexus Health's corporate tower, my mind briefly drifts back to my former desk at Stratum, where my 7 months of quiet, meticulous labor once sat tossed inside a stainless steel recycling bin. I never sought dramatic corporate warfare, nor did I ever step outside the boundaries of professional ethics to seek revenge. I simply stopped donating my time, my diagnostic tools, and my institutional expertise to an organization that devalued my work. I set hard boundaries, stepped away with my integrity intact, and allowed the natural consequences of arrogant management to unfold on their own terms. True professional strength does not lie in quietly enduring mistreatment to earn corporate approval. It lies in recognizing your own operational value, enforcing firm career boundaries, and stepping into rooms where your expertise is treated with the respect it commands.